Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for having me. So my name's Chen. I work for Cooperative Extension in Northern California. I cover most of the North Coast region, Sonoma, Mendocino, Lake counties. Napa has their own viticulture advisor because it's Napa, and they requested that. But a lot of my research and my work is focused around climate adaptation in vineyards. Almost all of it is, actually. And that's mostly what I'm going to talk to you about today, kind of expand on what Greg introduced earlier in this event. But we're going to look at extreme weather events and pest and fungal disease pressure and what we can do to address them or just, preserve our viticultural areas. And the first thing we have to do when we're looking at that is look at the impacts of climate change and the extreme weather events that come with it. When we're doing that, in my opinion, it's best to separate the climate impacts by whether they're direct or indirect in our vineyards. What they do in our vineyards is either a direct impact or an indirect impact. There are a lot of direct impacts that are really easy to identify. We have changes in the resource availability, soil salinity, just the extreme weather events, so heat waves, late frost, stuff like that. But we also have changes in things that are a little less obvious. Changes in our growing season length, right? Compression of the growing season. Changes in phenology, bud break, ripening, stuff like that. And then the big one that half of this talk is on is changes in pest behavior. A lot of these images are AI generated like these, but this slide is all pictures that I took. These are pictures I took in the last 5 or 6 years, and you can see the multiple extreme weather events we have to deal with in agriculture and in viticulture itself. So flooding, fire, right? I shouldn't have been there taking that picture, but I was doing research. Snow, which was uncommon where I live and maybe happens every 5 years or so. And then of course extreme heat, berry shrivel, sun damage, stuff like that. So when we're looking at changing climates, there are a lot of factors that impact vine health related to changing climates, but these three I think are the most important. Temperature, which affects all aspects of the vine and all aspects of organisms in your vineyard. Precipitation, very similar impact. We have irrigation. We don't have air conditioning for our vineyards, but precipitation still matters quite a bit. And then extreme weather events, these one-off events that are not unexpected, but they're not welcome, right? So heat waves, fire, late frost events, this all impacts how our grapevines grow and how they reproduce or make reproductive structures that we use for wine, as well as all of the organisms that are in the vineyard. And there are, a lot of other impacts of climate change on agriculture, right? Resource availability is one of them, and that could be local or regional or political. Resource availability is always a concern. Extreme sudden weather events, different kinds of stressors, we usually separate those into abiotic and biotic, either living or not. Pest and disease success and survival. Phenological timing of crops, our yield, which is what most people care about, and then the overall health and longevity of our grapevines. And I'm going to go into those three that I started with a little bit, right? Temperature is the big one. This impacts all living things. If you're a living organism, you are reliant that it is warm enough you don't freeze and not so hot that your cells start degrading, right? It can alter the physiology of our plants, of our insects, and for each species there's a different ideal range, right? This is most obvious with fungal pathogens that have a really stark line where they just stop growing or they slow down quite a bit. And it changes by cultivar too, so with wine grapes, we know they come from different regions. Some are better for colder climates, some are better for warmer climates. But we also have to worry about the ambient average temperatures when we're looking at both summer and winter and how that affects the growth of our grapevines. And I did my PhD under Andy Walker at UC Davis, and he always used to say that if you are concerned about the growth of your vine, there's only 3 things that matter, and it's temperature and temperature and temperature. Precipitation is another one. This is difficult, right? We know it's getting warmer, but we Well, and we also know that precipitation patterns are likely to change, but how? We don't really know how precipitation is going to change. We know it's going to get hotter. We don't know if it's going to rain more in this valley or less, or in summer or in winter, right? And that impacts crops and especially diseases, because we have irrigation for the crops. Precipitation is really impactful on the health and productivity of the diseases in the vineyard. And unfortunately, most grapes grow in Mediterranean climates, which is what is considered a border climate. It is much more likely to go toward arid conditions or very wet conditions, easier than a more stable climate like a desert or a rainforest. And then we have extreme weather events. These are many, and the impacts will depend on your climate that you're in, microclimate, mesoclimate, however you want to look at it. But when we're looking at these extreme weather events, the infrastructure really matters. What you've put in place to prepare for these events matters quite a bit. And it changes based on where you are. In coastal regions, where it's typically what we consider cold climate viticulture, heat waves can be a lot more damaging because we don't have the cultivars, we don't have the trellising style, we don't have the management practices that's prepared for heat waves near harvest. Where if you're inland, like the Central Valley in California, it's hot, we know heat waves are coming, so the varieties are chosen, the cultivars are chosen to be able to deal with that heat, and the trellising and infrastructure is designed to mitigate some of the damage from those extreme heat waves. And then wildfires, persistent problem, becoming more of a problem. Preparation of the environment around your vineyard and within your vineyard helps reduce the overall damage from wildfires. But we're talking about abiotic stressors. I'll get into biotic ones in a bit, but abiotic stressors are pretty much any environmental condition that can cause stress to a grapevine, and it can limit growth or reproductive capacity of that vine. This is from any source of stress that's not alive, not a living organism, and often we get these multiple stressors compounding on each other at any given time. And when I did my qualifying exam for my PhD, one of the professors made a point of asking me, should there be a field of research on abiotic stressors? Isn't life always stressed by something in the environment? Yes, but it can be to more and more extremes, right? Like when we have very high temperatures, that's going to affect any living organism more than a temperature where it's comfortable, even if it is having to deal with the comfortable temperature. So when we're looking at stressors in vines, we separate them by biotic or abiotic. I already explained abiotic. Biotic is organisms, pests, weeds, diseases, insects, stuff like that. Sometimes rodents, sometimes people. We actually had a car dealership at UC Davis one time film a car commercial in our research vineyard without asking us. So I would consider them a pest in that situation. But when we're looking at these, vine health is a function of the different stressors that are imposed upon it. Vine health is a function of what's available to it as a resource, minus, this should be minus, not plus, minus abiotic stressors and biotic stressors, because it has to deal with these as they come up. And they're persistent. A lot of the times we get heat every year. We get drought every year, or multiple years in a row. And the issue with this is that plants don't really have an immune system like we do. They do a form of additive resistance where they respond to things using biosynthesized defense compounds to mitigate the damage of these stressors. Abiotic stressors are relatively persistent, so they redirect resources away from responses to other stressors. Often that means that biotic stressors become more of an issue. But grapes, and most plants, especially grapes, best crop, can tolerate many, many stressors at one time, but there are limits, especially if we're short on water or nutrients or sunlight, right? So the susceptibility of a vine to any given biotic stressor or pest is a function of how much abiotic stress it's under at a given time, and more abiotic stress means more impacts from the biotic stressor. So I have a lot of slides with California outlines. I apologize. I was going to switch it to Oregon, but I was like, I should probably talk about things I know about. So I'm going to stick with California. This is an image of temperature averages and the temperature 1 year, 2020 to 2021, where anything in yellow, orange, or red is a higher than average temperature based on historical temperature records. It's hot. We know this, right? And extreme temperatures, extreme heat, that can lead to higher evapotranspiration in your vineyard, which means more water demand, and more water demand means more damaged fruit, especially if you don't have the water. It can do other things too. This is a study on the left here, this text is from a study by Bernath et al. In 2021, looking at the changes in phenological events timing between 1985 and 2018. And you can see that each of the major phenological events related to reproductive success, that occurred 1 to 2 weeks earlier on average in 2018 than it did 20, 30 years before that, 40 years before that, yeah. That's Central Europe, but it is applicable in most of the places where we grow grapes, because grapes have a climate type they prefer. And to make that point, I made this figure of heat accumulation hours or growing degree days in Sonoma County. And the two lines that I would like you to focus on are the red line and the purple line. The red line is 2012, the purple line is 2020. And if we're looking at a target growing degree day, say about 1,800 growing degree days, you can see that that occurred 50 to 60 days earlier in 2020 than in 2012. That is normal now, right? And that's not to say every year is going to be like this, but this is the trend. We also reach a higher growing degree day accumulation by the end of the season in 2020 than 2012. Just, in summary, it's getting hotter. Our Winkler index regions are changing. Napa Valley used to be a region 2 Winkler index region, which is a moderate to cool climate region. I would say, looking at the data, it's somewhere between a 3 and a 4 now. And that's true in a lot of places. Not everywhere, but a lot of places. And what does this do? What does all this heat do to the grapevines? Well, we care about the fruit first, and then we care about the vines second, unless you care about your vines more, which I respect that. But if we look at grapes, you can see that there are peaks. There are points where we would consider the grapes at full maturity. And this slide is from Dr. Concorderall, not mine. But you can see that in the berry size, August 30th, that's when we hit the highest berry size, and then it degrades pretty rapidly after that. That would be peak maturity. Same with anthocyanins at the bottom left here, bottom left. You can see that it does hit its peak right around the same time, and then it degrades rapidly. This is a problem, especially if our growing season is getting shorter. The issues with labor availability at a drop of a hat when you have a heat wave late August, that is going to be a problem going forward. I wanted to give you some hope. There are short-term solutions that exist, right? So when we're dealing with this, especially in places like a coastal climate that is not used to heat waves, that is all of a sudden getting a very intense heat wave around harvest, the infrastructure's not there. You're not going to change your varieties at a drop of a hat, right? So what do? You look for Band-Aid solutions for that moment. Heat and sun damage, big concern here. So this is actually an image I took in 2016 of fried fruit. It got sunburned, and you can see which side it got sunburned on too. But to resolve this, what we tried to do, my research into this subject was shade nets, right? A quick solution, not the cheapest, not the easiest to apply, but if you're facing a week of 110 degrees Fahrenheit the week before harvest, you want something to protect your fruit to make sure that you can keep your contracts and you hit your target tonnage, right? So shade nets, artificial shading is an option. And this is what it does. The bottom left, those two images are sunburned fruit, and the bottom right two images are from a grapevine right next to those that were sunburned using black shade nets. And you can see the very far right picture, there's no damage on that fruit. About the same sun exposure from the outside, but under the net, a lot more shading. I characterized the damage ratings of the grapevines, just of the clusters, just based visually. And you can see 0 is no damage, all the way up to 3, highest rating damage. And we also compared the effect of shade nets on preventing berry damage with adding water, right? Because that's what a lot of people do. We add water. Excuse me. And this figure here shows the results pretty well. You can see an A on the left. That is the effect of shade nets on the percentage of damaged fruit in each category. 0 being no damage, 3 being the most damage. It almost completely eliminated the most severe damage on the clusters during this heat wave in 2016. That's in contrast to the second figure there, B, which is irrigation. And you can see there's really no difference in the number of damaged clusters at any of the damage ratings using just increased irrigation amounts. A little decrease, but nothing significant statistically. So, short-term solution. Shade nets, yeah, they work. They're expensive to put out. They're expensive to maintain. But if you're going to lose your fruit, it's an option. Now we're going to get into drought a little bit. Drought on the West Coast, in my experience, at least where I work and where I live and where I learn grapes, it comes in cycles. In 2016, we had a pretty bad drought year in most of California. And then a lot of people were saying, well, we need to do drought research, drought tolerance research. We need to do sun or solar radiation mitigation research. So we started doing that. And then 2017 hit, and people were still saying, yeah, we still need this. And then 2018, with a little drought, but nothing in the North Coast of California. And then the interest kind of declined. And then 19 and 20, we had no interest in drought research. And then 2021 hit, which is right about when I was hired in my position. And then all the funding for drought research came back. So we have kind of a short-term amnesia in the drought conditions that exist in our regions where we grow grapes. We need to continuously look at solutions and not just periodically. But water stress on grapevines is really impactful. It depends what time of the year you get that drought stress. That'll affect what it does to the grapevine, right? Spring, early spring, late spring, that affects shoot growth, bud development, and flower development, or fruit set. Early summer to midsummer, you get changes in your berry size and the potential for the grapes to hit a certain size. You can also get poor development of phenolic compounds. If you do it at the right time, you get good phenolic compound development. And then in late summer, that affects your yields and degrades your fruit, like in those series of graphs I showed you earlier. And if you look at the classic berry development curve, this is where those things happen to the fruit. Smaller berries and poor shoot growth and bud development early on, changes in phenolic compound biosynthesis in the middle, right after viriation, and then the dreaded hang time. If you're asked to leave your grapes on for too long and a heat wave's coming up, I would consider not doing that because phenolic compounds degrade very rapidly under extreme heat and solar radiation. Be careful with that one. So how does this all relate to biotic stressors? A lot of the previous slides were focused on just the abiotic stressors in the extreme weather events that directly impact our yield and our vine growth. Those impacts also change the conditions for our biotic stressors, our pests and pathogens in the vineyard system. And here is the thing that ties them together, my tie together slide. So heat stress, this obviously impacts the grapevine, right? It increases water demand, vine respiration, but the timing of that heat stress can be a good thing for the vine. It can increase foliar growth if it's early enough in the season, right? A warm spring means better shoot growth early on. That can result in more available sugars for phytophagous insects, insects that feed on those sugars. That might be bad for your pest pressure later in the season. Similarly, with drought stress, I'd say this is probably worse for plants than heat stress, but that can increase your whole vine oxidative stress, right? Oxidative stress means that you have oxygen-free radicals. Free radical oxygens destroy parts of DNA. If that's the case, the plant has to respond, and typically it does that by making polyphenols that are antioxidants. Tannins, flavonthiols, anthocyanins, all these things are created to deal with abiotic stress, sometimes biotic too, in the case of tannins. But doing this redirects the resources of that grapevine away from dealing with the biotic stressor to deal with the drought stress that it's under at the moment. Again, changes in your phenolic composition. but it could also change the morphological and phenological characteristics of your grapevine. Xylem vessel size is one of the key ones there, where you have a change in the diameter of your xylem vessels, a change in the hydraulic conductivity, and a change in the capillary forces that pull the water up those xylem vessels. And under drought conditions, the xylem vessel changes seem to be good for Pierce's disease, for Xylella fastidiosa. So there is a inner working relationship there, unfortunately, typically in the favor of Xylella. So how do pests and pathogens themselves, if the main focus now, deal with extreme weather? So the impacts that really affect them, or the effects of climate change that impact our biotic pests, are the changes in average temperature, usually increases, the abiotic stress demands on plant resources, the life cycle development and how it changes based on the heat accumulation hours, and then changes in the distribution of their host plants and the range of their host plants. Because of these, there are expectations for vineyard pests going forward, right? Changes in, I put migratory behavior, that's not right. It's more like functional range, like where they live. Changes in how well they survive freezing temperatures over winter. Changes in how they interact with both the grapevine and their predators, parasitoids, and if they happen to hunt other insects or other things. Changes in species interaction. And then the effectiveness of our beneficial species. That's also an important one. Invertebrates are usually the focus of biotic pests and diseases. I mean, viruses, bacteria, fungi too, but if we're talking about year to year, I hear a lot more about invertebrates. There are a lot of ways they can respond to climate change, but there are a few that are cited several times as the expectation, right? So they can move to a climate that's more suitable for them. They'd probably have to hitch a ride, likely on a truck or something, but that is likely and that is happening already. They can shift their phenology, their developmental timing, to correspond with the local changes in their environment. So maybe they'll hatch a little later, maybe they'll get through their first insar a little quicker. That's pretty common too. And the last one is they can adapt to new conditions and the associated impacts on the ecosystems. That's evolution. I don't think that's been really observed yet, but they could develop new traits that help them deal with the new conditions. Migration is one of the most common ones. This is something we're seeing with glassy wing sharpshooter in California. We are concerned about that. We are watching out for it. But typically in the northern hemisphere, things are moving north. It's not just insects. It's also plant species and animal species. There's even a prediction of redwood trees, their native range moving more north into Oregon. So it's happening all over the North Coast, all over the Pacific Northwest. But this is kind of a snapshot of what we're seeing with glassy wing sharpshooter. That's been around for a long time. Usually it restricted itself to Southern California and Central California. It's moving up now. There was some spotted in Napa, and there's some spotted here and there in Marin, right? But it's appearing in places where it historically hasn't appeared much before, if at all. And that's what we're looking out for too. And that has something to do with the changes in temperature, the changes in CO2 levels, the changes in their host species availability as well. This is what I would call a functional range, right? Where it's actually functional, where the conditions are within the range that the pest prefers. In any given climate, this can be a concern, but there is also the concern of which pests and which species or subcategories or subspecies of those pests are more generalized than others. There was a really cool study in Australia, I think it was Australia, where they looked at grapevine trunk diseases of multiple kinds to see how they perform in different areas, expecting to see hotter conditions in colder climates, desertification in some areas. So they inoculated different vines in different regions to see how they survive. And they didn't all perform the same, as you'd expect, right? But these are fungi that live inside of the wood. The vines are irrigated, right? They're fertilized. They have all the resources they need, but some of them are just not good at adapting to new conditions. And that is something we need to look out for when we're looking at the movement of pests and diseases in response to climate change. There's also the impact on disease expression. Host pathogen interaction is pretty broadly impacted by the environmental conditions, like the drought and Xylella fastidiosa, right? Some abiotic stressors increase the virulence or the symptomatic expression of diseases in grapevines. Trunk diseases are a good example from my experience. In California, we had, you saw that picture, we had 5 or 6 years of drought, followed by not only a lot of rain, but before that, spring frosts, summer rains. It was a strange year in 21, 22. But what this does is weakens the vine for a long period of time, drought stress, right? Probably heat stress too. And then it provides all the resources necessary for those trunk diseases to become symptomatic, even though I got a bunch of calls from people that said they don't have trunk disease or they've never seen expression of trunk disease in their vineyard. All of a sudden we cut down a couple vines and it's, half black tissue. So that was really interesting and something that I keep an eye on. But you got to remember that grapevine pests, they're living organisms too. They are also affected by the abiotic stressors and their available resources, as well as any biotic stressors they might have. And then back to Xylella, because Pierce's disease is always an issue. Xylella fastidiosa it depends on the strain or the clade, but there's more than two, but there's 2 common ones where I live. There's one that is less impactful on the vine health, and it is tolerant to cold winter temperatures, and then there's the one from Temecula. I say Temecula, it's Southern California. But the one from the hotter region cannot survive cold temperatures, below 53 degrees Fahrenheit for prolonged periods. And before you ask me, I don't know what prolonged periods are. I think it's like 200 hours, but it is cold for a long time. It actually gets rid of the bacteria in the grapevine, and that's great. But with our warming climate, warmer winter temperatures, they've been reducing the success rate of overwinter recovery in grapevines from Xylella fastidiosa. In California, we have data that shows that winter temperatures have risen 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the 70s, and that is makes it less likely for Xylella to be removed from the grapevine thanks to cold temperatures. There are other issues with winter temperatures. There's the issue of bud quiescence in grapevines. If it's not cold for long enough in winter, the grapevine dormant buds won't grow either. That is an issue in places like Bakersfield in Southern California, where they have to chemically induce bud break in some cases, not all cases, in some cases. That is also a concern, but that's more of a direct impact. This is what Xylella looks like in the xylem vessels. Again, water stress also makes this worse. So you can imagine, as the trend goes, warmer winter temperatures followed by a drought-stressed summer is really good for this bacteria. It's a combination of the effects of the abiotic stress conditions, the inability or the lack of resources of the grapevine to deal with both, and then Xylella being very happy with drought and hot winter temperatures. But plants are exposed to these things all the time. They have stress constantly in different forms. So often plants will tailor their response using their defense compounds to specific combinations through multiple means. But they'll respond in a very specific way to a very specific combination of stressors. And that is something that needs a lot more research. Heat and drought are hand in hand most of the time, right? If you have hot conditions, it's usually dry. And if it's not, it's really humid and you have mildew problems, so that's a problem too. But heat and drought together can decrease plant growth and yields more so than each one individually, at least in a greenhouse setting based on the study that I read. That means that the grapevine is responding to or trying to respond to both at the same time. That includes reactive oxygen species production or responses to that by biosynthesizing antioxidants, and also differences in hormonal signaling. We have an issue with Pinot leaf curl in the area where I work. We're still not sure what causes that, but I would guess it's a difference in signaling from shoot to root. Grapevine trunk diseases and fungi, again, they have this desirable range. Usually it's between 25 and 40 degrees Celsius. But they might also be changing how they respond, similar to how grapevines respond with differences in xylem vessel size when there's not a lot of water. It's also an issue. And getting into that, there's the issue, another issue, a lot of issues, of microbial adaptation, right? So microbes tend to go through generations a lot faster than macroorganisms do. And unless they can adapt to hotter conditions, they're not going to do very well in the changing climate. But if they can, we have an issue with their persistence or their spread, right? Right now, there are more or less temperature boundaries to where some diseases and some microbes can go. Candida auris is the case study for humans. It's a human fungal pathogen. It was originally, not originally, but historically only infected immunocompromised people. Not sure why, but I would guess it has something to do with body temperature. And I believe in the last 10 years or so, it's been recorded on 3 continents, more or less simultaneously, infecting non-immunocompromised people. And the theory is that it adapted to hotter conditions in the ambient environment and then could tolerate human body temperatures better. Now, we haven't seen that in vineyards or in cropping systems yet, and it's not going to be the same because they don't have thermal regulation like we do. But it is something to be aware of as we're looking at how are these microbes adapting to hotter, drier conditions. Viruses are similarly problematic, although they require their host to be functional. They need host cells to reproduce. And for us, we get rid of them using fever, right? So you get, not always, but a lot of the time, fever increases the body temperature to the point where they can't reproduce that well, the viruses. Again, if they adapt to hotter conditions, our fever needs to go up to be as functional in removing them. If our fever goes up to too high, we have to go to the hospital. So this is a concern too. And then thinking about bacteria, same problems, right? Bacteria, quick generations, plenty of genetic mutations, right? It's CRISPR-Cas9. Thanks, bacteria. But there are already a lot of bacterial species present in our environment that are adapted to these hot, dry conditions. The good thing is most of them don't negatively impact our vineyards. Some of them do, but most of them don't. The concern is, what if a bacterial species that can impact our vineyard adapts to hotter conditions, can tolerate the changes in aridity and high temperatures, and now that localized species composition of bacteria in your vineyard shifts, so that takes over from the older, adapted, hot, dry bacteria. It's another concern. This is speculation, but something to think about. And then there are, quote-unquote, new diseases that we have to be concerned about. Lyme disease is the human example. It was well known that Lyme disease was on the East Coast for a very long time. On the West Coast, a lot of people didn't expect it, right? And as soon as we started getting Lyme disease, there were a lot of people that were misdiagnosed, or maybe they didn't have a doctor that was looking for it. And that led to a lot of health problems until people realized that Lyme disease was on the West Coast and it was prevalent. Now we look for it. Now we know to catch it early if somebody comes in with symptoms. That is similar to red blotch virus in grapevines. Not the same, because we didn't know it existed to start with, but we weren't testing for red blotch until after 2008 when it was identified in Napa Valley. Before that, for decades probably, it was already in California, at least a few years, enough that it caused a problem. And we were testing for leaf roll, right? Not just the vineyards, but the nurseries. Everybody was testing for leaf roll because it looks like leaf roll. If you don't know what to look for with red blotch, with the red veins and the blotchiness, it looks a lot like leaf roll. So in that condition, we didn't know what to test for, right? It's not quite the same as Lyme disease where we knew that disease existed, but we did know that something was wrong with these. So as we're looking forward in these future climates and the potential adaptation of microbes and pests, other pests, we should be we should consider that there will be new diseases that we don't know about yet, that either evolve to deal with the new climate or become more suitable in this new climate. I'm good. What do we do with our vineyards? What does a climate adaptive vineyard look like? I have a few points here. So one is resource use efficiency. Water use efficiency is the big one. Especially in places where there are grapes, water tends to be scarce. Not everywhere, but most places. So increasing water use efficiency, we've already done that a few times, but the big one is through flood irrigation to drip irrigation. That is a perfect example of increasing water use efficiency, but now we have soil moisture probes, we have variable flow rates, we have smart meters on our end caps or on our submains that can keep track of exactly how much water is going out. That is really useful. But we got to do that with other things too. All of our nutrient inputs. Are we using precision agricultural techniques to identify where we need to apply nitrogen, where we need to apply phosphorus, potassium, all the big nutrients, right? That not only saves you money in the long run, right? I mean, maybe the upfront cost for that precision tech is a little high, but it also improves your ecosystem in your vineyard a lot better and the surrounding ecosystem, right? Nitrification of waterways is a concern. And then we also should be looking for alternative resources for different things. I have a case study at the end of this where I'll go through something like that. Extreme weather resilience is a big one. So I was talking earlier about how extreme weather events really are more impactful based on your infrastructure, right? So if we have a resilient infrastructure to deal with the majority of the things we know vineyards have problems with, frost, right? We'll put in some kind of frost protection. We have sun and heat damage. How do we protect the fruit? If we have those things, then we can adapt quickly to a situation, even if it's unexpected. And then, of course, different cultivars. Got to try new things. And I know that's easier said than done. But to Greg's point earlier, there are a lot of grape varieties out there that we can make wine out of. They're all Vitis vinifera, or the majority of them are. But we stick with a handful. And I have a cool pie chart showing you that in a bit. Effective management practices, back to precision vineyard practices. If we're looking at, I don't expect viticulture to get here anytime soon, but there are almond orchards in Australia that irrigate or add fertilizer tree by tree. Those are trees. It's a little easier to do that. But we could scale down our monitoring of what grapevines need to a more precise level rather than block by block or whole vineyard status, right? And that, again, we need to develop things for that, but we can do it. We can design our vineyards better to use less resources, to be exposed to less issues early on. The best example there that I have is row orientation. If you have the correct row orientation in your vineyard where each side of the canopy gets relatively the same amount of sunlight throughout the day, you'll probably have less issues with sunburn on one of those sides compared to one that gets 80% of the sunlight on one side and then 20% on the other throughout a given day. You also have better uniform ripening that way. Monitoring, always something you should keep doing, not just for pests and diseases, but your vine health, the status of your vine, the pruning weights, the vigor, the total yields, right? All these things are very useful metrics if you know what to do with them. And then, again, looking at alternate strategies for management. Is there something you can do that's more effective or helps you adapt your vineyard more to unexpected weather events? We have to prioritize the health of your site and your grapevines, right? Healthy soils support a lot more life, a lot more organisms, and a better ecosystem in your farm than a soil that is not dead, but mostly sand, right? That's really good because there are beneficial organisms that need healthy soil to persist. The poster over here, Alexander's poster on nematodes, is a great example of beneficial organisms and how they can be used. But soil is very important, but also the health of the vine, right? How long does your vineyard live? How stressed is it? If it has less stress, it will be able to deal with biotic stressors a lot better as they come up, or a sudden abiotic stressor. Monitoring pest behavior. Pests are going to adapt to new conditions. The interesting thing is that we don't know if the beneficials, the predators and parasitoids, are going to as well. They probably will eventually, but they seem to lag behind the phytophagous or parasitic pests that exist in our vineyard. That's problematic, right? Like if their prey or their quarry hatches a week earlier than they evolved to deal with, then the beneficial organisms won't be as effective in controlling them. And this is not something we've seen in vineyards, but it has been observed in other cropping systems, and mostly around phytophagous insects, where the insects that feed on the plant tissue or the phloem may increase or shorten their phenological development in response to hotter temperatures, where the beneficials take a little more time. And there's also the concern of new pests, right? Pests that we don't expect in certain areas. They can show up now in some areas that are more conducive to their environment that they like. And then the last one on here is community cooperation, I think. It's really important to keep the knowledge that we have in our vineyards. One way to do that is make jobs desirable to improve employee retention and well-being. But these are people that have been here a long time. They not only know the region, the crop, but they might know your vineyard. They might know the weird spot that gets all the fertilizer but doesn't grow. That's important stuff, right? Maybe that's something that you need to converse with them about on a regular basis. Keeping employees, if possible, that have experience and knowledge, that's great. We also want to talk to our neighbors, especially with things like spotted lanternfly coming. Hopefully not, but as it goes, we should worry about that. Because your vineyard manager neighbor might see it before you, but the master gardener down the street might also see it before you. Talking to people and asking them what they're seeing, not just with pests and insects, but also what happened to your grapes last year? How did they perform? What was the titratable acidity and the Brix levels at harvest, and when did you harvest? These things will change, and if we get more perspectives, it's better for us to prepare that way. Now, I wanted to also make a quick note about varieties. We have a lot of varieties. We have hundreds of grapevine varieties. This is California, and what each, vineyard representation is. We have 2 cultivars that make up 40% of the market, and it's changed a little since I made this figure, so it's more like 35% now, but it's Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon. They make up more than a third of all the grapes planted in California. That's a bottleneck, right? That limits the amount of genetic and phenotypic diversity that we have available to deal with sudden extreme events or new pests. I understand this, though, because you have to sell your grapes. You got to sell your wine. And if you got $20 to go to the store to buy alcohol of some kind, and if you choose wine, more often than not, consumers are going to buy something they know, right? They're going to buy something with a name that they recognize, and those 2 are 2 of the most recognizable names that we have. Zinfandel, Merlot, Cabernet, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc. They're very common. But we do want to look at maybe planting a trial row somewhere where you have 10 varieties. Let them live out their whole life. See how they adapt as the climate changes. Maybe when you replant next time, you won't want to use Pinot Noir. Maybe you'll want to use something else because it does better in that little experimental row that you put out. It's the same with rootstocks, but I think rootstocks are a little easier to deal with. Rootstocks typically are designed for specific settings and specific issues. Drought tolerance, flooding, specific pests, right? But you don't have to put the name of the rootstock on the bottle unless you're really thorough. And most consumers don't know the rootstock anyways. So you have the option to pick a rootstock that might be better at dealing with warmer spring soil temperatures or a new soil pest, something like that. Rootstocks are an easier one to start with, I think, than scion varieties and cultivars. But if you're looking at scion varieties and cultivars, the first thing I would address is heat, right? Temperatures. And the best way to do that, I think, is to look at where they came from. A lot of the varieties that we grow for wine today, they were developed in Europe at some point, often by a monastery with nothing better to do. So they ended up very adapted to specific conditions, right? Like German varieties, Gewürztraminer, Riesling, they're known to be cold climate varieties. Germany's cold. They developed it for that climate. Southern Italian varieties, it's pretty hot down there. So the varieties are really good at and adapted to hot conditions. If you have a prediction for how your climate is going to change, even if it's off by quite a bit, the average prediction is it's going to get hotter. So how do we deal with that? Maybe move south on the map here and try to find something that was developed in a slightly warmer climate than you have now, and you might do well. You might keep up those high quality grapes. Okay, so my last segment here is frost protection and water conservation. I'll do this relatively quick because I need time for questions. This is one of those alternate resources things. I did this study in 2023, and we're supposed to continue it this year. It's not up yet. But this is in Lake County, California. It's a very hot, dry place, but it gets very cold in winter for California. And I did this in collaboration with a local vineyard management company. And we had 25 different contributors for this. What we did was we put up inversion towers to measure if there was a temperature inversion during frost season in spring. These were designed by Mark Batney, but we deployed them. Our goal was to identify regions within Lake County where frost fans could replace or heavily subsidize overhead frost irrigation. And this was really important for a couple of reasons. One, because resource allocation. Water in Lake County is mostly from groundwater. Groundwater, if overused, can cause quite a few issues with water availability and quality. But also because there was a culturally important fish species that, to the local Pomo tribes, there's more than one Pomo tribe there, that they've used for food and survival for generations. And in dry winters, the use of spring frost irrigation reduced the tributaries where they swim to reproduce, similar to how salmon do that, right? Except it's lake to lake instead of ocean to stream, right? That's a problem, and we're also concerned about, more frequent later spring frost events. The hitch is the fish I was talking about. It's a large species of minnow, and when I think minnow, I don't think something that's the size of my hand or my forearm, right? But it's native to the region. It's known as the chi to the local Pomo tribes, and it's been staple food for a very long time. It's culturally symbolic. It's very important to them. And because the frost irrigation has been shown to lower the water levels in those tributaries where they reproduce, or they go through to reproduce, there's a concern that it's affecting the population dynamics and the population sizes. So there's disagreements on how we should use that water, because water is a scarce resource. Do we preserve the viticulture that's there now, or do we preserve the culturally important species for the region? Obviously, there's two sides to this. It's difficult to deal with sometimes. But our goal here was to avoid getting to the point where legal action or regulations were necessary, which would definitely cripple large portions of the viticultural world there. And to do that, we looked at these temperature inversion towers. To successfully have a frost fan, you need a radiative freeze. You need a freeze where the temperature at higher elevation is warmer than at ground level, and it has to be, on average, when mixed together, still warmer than 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Otherwise, you're mixing cold air with cold air. The other kind of freeze is the advective freeze. This is when a cold air front moves in quickly. You can't use a frost fan in that situation. Overhead frost irrigation is a very common way to deal with frost in spring. It's an exothermic reaction that releases heat as the water freezes, but you need to continuously apply new water that's freezing for it to maintain a certain temperature above freezing, slightly above freezing. That's problematic as far as infrastructure goes. If you have a sprinkler that fails, you have power that goes out. If somebody forgot to turn it on or forgot to turn it off, you're going to get more damage than if you didn't do that at all. And it can increase your total water use in your vineyard by 20 to 30% per acre per year. So it's highly water intensive and finicky as far as infrastructure, right? But it's the main source of frost protection in a lot of places. Wind machines mix air from higher up, warmer air higher up with ground level air that's a little cooler, and has high upfront costs. These fans are very expensive, and I'm not going to quote them to you because they change from place to place and year to year, but they're expensive. And they don't use a lot of energy, and they don't use any water, so really all that cost is upfront, plus maintenance, of course. But you need about 10 to 25 horsepower in your fan to cover 1 acre. So per acre, you need about a 10, 25 horsepower fan at 35-foot elevation. So it's like a tower. You've seen them, I'm sure. But again, only useful during radiative freezes, and that has to be predictable and reliable. It has to happen in that place relatively often and reliably every year in order to just use fans. So that limits where they're useful. That's why we did the temperature loggers. We put a temperature logger at 30 feet, one at 5 feet, to see the air temperature difference during frost events in 25 different places across Lake County. We did this so we could find out where a frost fan would be a good investment, right? And again, this is based on Mark Badney's design, who is my former colleague at Cooperative Extension. So Lake County, where we did this study, is shaped like a bowl. And unfortunately, lower elevation places are much more prone to frost. This is where we targeted this study because this is where it would have the biggest impact. Most of the temperature loggers were in the valley at some point. Our results kind of showed that there's hardly any places that fit the requirement that we need. It has to be reliable. The inversion has to be reliable, and that was the roadblock we hit most often. They happened, but maybe 1 out of 3 frost events was a radiative frost, not an advective frost. So we can't really rely on fans there. In 11% of sites, we had reliable temperature inversions. 27%, we had unreliable ones. These are the ones that you get 1 or 2 inversions a year in spring, and the rest were too cold to use frost fans. And then more than half of the sites where you couldn't use fans at all. And that was more consistent than the sites that could use them. The difference is the reliable inversion places typically were on hillsides of some kind. So this was the Kelsey Bench and Scotts Valley areas of Lake County. The unreliable ones were at the foothills, so they were at the edge of the bowl. That varied in topography and elevation, but generally that was the trend. And then the ones with no temperature inversions were on the valley floor, closest to a huge lake, right? With these frost fans, the takeaway of this really was that your topography matters more than anything. If you're going to use fans, flat, low-lying elevation areas, shouldn't use them. Probably shouldn't even invest in them. We didn't see any temperature inversions in a lot of these places. Hillsides might be the target use case for this, but how many hillside vineyards are there in a county that's shaped like a bowl with the majority of the surface area being flat valley bottom? There's a few. But what this really tells us is that you can use fans regardless, but as you need a backup system. You need that frost irrigation system to ensure you don't lose your crop by relying solely on fans. Because the initial work for this was preservation of the Clear Lake hitch habitat, this is continuing and hopefully funded. I don't know right now. But it is still continuing to make sure that the sites that we identified are still inversion prone, I guess. But it can increase water use efficiency and is a model for that in a lot of places, right? Imagine if 11% of all vineyards that use frost irrigation switch to fans the majority of the time. That's 20 to 30% of their annual water usage in their vineyard preserved for those 11 vineyards. That's a lot of water. It's a good amount of water. Could be 0.2 to 0.6 acre feet if you have a lot of frost per acre. So I went over a little, but questions and all. Summary, abiotic stressors are really impactful on the influence of pests and disease, or biotic stressors, right? The abiotic stressors affect the grapevine directly, but also the pests and diseases, and also how they interact with each other. So we do need to look at these extreme weather events and make sure that they are addressed in some way, or at least we prepare for them. Host and pathogen. Host and pathogen interaction is really important, and we need to, I didn't change this, that's okay. We need to make sure that our IPM strategies, our beneficial insects, our responses to pests and diseases are ready for changing conditions, migration of pests and diseases, new ones that show up that aren't yet known or aren't yet known in a specific area. We have existing solutions already. We have things that are Band-Aid solutions that we can throw out there because our infrastructure is not there yet. But one idea I've been playing with is a movable trellis system where we can go from a VSP to a California sprawl using like a ratchet system or something. It's been tested before, but I don't think it was tested right. That's infrastructure, right? That's new infrastructure, and it could cost a lot, but it might, if we get it right, it might help solve this problem of being prepared for heat waves in a coastal climate, where we need the VSP to get enough exposure for the fruit to ripen, but we also want some protection from the sunlight without having to throw up shade nets every time there's a heat wave we didn't expect. And we do need more research, of course. We need more work into not only the combined stress responses to specific stresses that are common in your area, but also to alternative options, like the frost fans and the overhead frost irrigation. That's the kind of stuff that we need to look at and see where we can implement already existing solutions in our vineyards. I did upload this presentation on my website if you want it. I have this QR code on the next slide too, but I always insist that I show people my dogs. So these are my dogs. It's Milo and Blue.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, let's give them a round of applause.